All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on accelerated approval, a discussion on the changing landscape of the Food and Drug Administration's life-saving pathway. My name is Michael Ward. I'm the Vice President of Public Policy and Government Relations with the Alliance for Aging Research, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's discussion. So FDA approvals are seen as the gold standard globally. As rigorous clinical trial data is reviewed both for safety for the patient and effectiveness in treating disease. However, it became apparent during the early stages of the HIV/AIDS crisis in the late 1980s and early 1990s that the standard approval process may, in cases where there is a desperate unmet clinical need and that affected patients will face death or reversible clinical decline in the absence of treatment, that there may be diseases and situations where the normal approval pathway may not be the most appropriate. As a result, in 1992, 30 years ago, which is hard to believe at this point, Congress created the accelerated approval pathway, which maintains the same safety and effectiveness standard, but relies on a surrogate clinical endpoint, which indicates that therapeutic is likely to have clinical benefit. The accelerated approval pathway has experienced many success stories over the years. Its initial use during the HIV crisis enabled access to treatments for the disease, making it a survivable chronic condition rather than a death sentence. Therapeutics for the treatment of metastatic cancers have extended lifespan, and it has encouraged the development of drugs for rare diseases, where fully establishing clinical benefit may take an even longer period of time than for other diseases due to the limited patient populations available for clinical trials. So the pathway is now 30 years old. As with anyone that hits a milestone birthday, it's time for retrospection about what has worked well and where there is room for improvement. While there are some changes to the program that will help the FDA to better operationalize accelerated approval, discussions have also gotten wrapped up in the larger environmental discussion around drug pricing. Third parties, such as the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, known as ICER, have advocated for reduced payment for drugs and devices approved through the pathway, which has since also been encouraged by the advisors to Congress on the Medicare and Medicaid programs, known as MedPAC and MACPAC, respectively. Also in the last year, the Medicare program has severely limited access to a new class of Alzheimer's treatments and designated drugs in that class that were approved through accelerated approval as requiring a higher threshold of data than those approved through the standard approval process in order for the agency to consider consideration for wider coverage. So this environment provides the context for the insightful conversation that I know that we'll have today with a distinguished panel of experts that can help us untangle fact from fiction in these discussions, as well as how policymakers can maintain focus on patients first and foremost. So first speaker will be Russ Paulson, who is a nationally recognized nonprofit leader and innovator. Under his leadership, a series of nonprofit programs and teams have saved hundreds of lives, helped to rebuild and heal communities across the nation, and brought cutting-edge technology to public health and human services. Russ joined Us Against Alzheimer's as the Chief Operating Officer in 2019. Since then, the organization built a web and telephone platform that delivers information tailored to where a specific user is on their Alzheimer's journey, received its first ever funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and assembled a 100 organization coalition to set a national Alzheimer's risk reduction goal. Maggie Jawalski is the Director of Advocacy at Six Cells. In this role, she works to engage different stakeholders through outreach efforts and the development of advocacy tools. She bridges her technical background in clinical research with her health communication skills to create content that fosters a connection, shares information, and sparks a call for action in their community. Before joining the Six Cells team, Maggie worked as a program associate at PCORI, managing a portfolio of clinical research projects designed to eliminate health disparities among ethnic minorities and underserved populations. And then Dr. Ken Thorpe was unable to join us today, but in his stead, we're excited to have Candace DeMatteis join the discussion. Candace has served as the policy director for the Partnership to Fight Chronic Disease since January 2008. PFCD is committed to both raising awareness of the human and economic toll of chronic diseases and highlighting solutions that address the challenges equitably for all affected. As policy director, Candace is responsible for monitoring and shaping health policy related to chronic disease prevention and management, including many aspects of health reform implementation related to enhancing health for all in America. Most recently, she has led efforts to develop several white papers examining near-term opportunities to improve health and lower costs within Medicaid, addressing health disparities and enhancing equity, as well as challenges facing people living with multiple chronic conditions. So I will let our distinguished panelists take the lead for the next section of our discussion. And so, Russ, I'll open the floor to you.
See if I can unmute myself successfully after how many years on Zoom. Thank you, Michael. Thanks for inviting me and Us Against Alzheimer's to be here. It's an important discussion. We were disappointed to learn that the accelerated approval pathway is apparently available to some, but payers, at least one, would prefer it to not mean the same for others. Our experiences getting an accelerated approval we thought was going to be the end of the journey for our patients, and it turns out that there are others who want to have second guessing rights, and then that was really surprising and disappointing to us. But it's an important pathway. It's saved lives through the years, as you mentioned, and it's something that we think we need to protect. There's language in some of the PDUFA bills that could do that, which we can talk about a little bit later, but excited to be here. Thanks, Michael.
All right, thanks, Russ. Maggie?
Yes, again, thank you so much for having me here, for letting Sickle Cell speak at such an important event. So I'm the Director of Advocacy with the organization Sickle Cells. We are a nonprofit that does sickle cell disease advocacy. And this is such an important conversation for us because, as you know, the drugs that are serving this unmet need is especially crucial across the sickle cell community. We found, especially over the last few years, we had a treatment recently approved through this pathway, and it's been a wonderful opportunity for our community to access treatments that they haven't had the ability to access before. Our organization, one of our advocacy priorities is really looking at access and coverage and the importance of providing access for these really at-risk communities. And so I think it's a really important pathway that we advocate for, and we really see the impact, and we're happy to be here and share our community stories and how important this program is.
And thanks, Maggie. Candace?
Hi, and thank you so much for hosting this important discussion on a critically important topic for anyone dealing with chronic disease, but particularly those with serious or life-threatening conditions. So we're thrilled to be here. I am going to ask you to indulge me for a minute because we have a little bit of research I wanted to share. But I wanted to introduce the topic and share a couple slides. PFCD is actively engaged on this issue and has been for a number of years. And that is led by our chair, Ken Thorpe, who as a health economist has an interesting approach on this topic. One thing I wanted to highlight is that we do have a lot of different resources on our website that talk about the pathway. We have a document that includes quotes from some of these leading experts, including members of the FDA, who talk about the pathway's purpose, its value, and its impact, which I'm excited to talk more about today. And under Ken's leadership, we've also taken an aim at one of the primary arguments against accelerated approval drugs that we've seen raised by MACPAC, state Medicaid programs, ICER, and other critics. And that work focuses on addressing concerns that these drugs are driving costs. States, starting with National Governors Association and a number of state Medicaid programs, have literally circled a bullseye on Medicaid coverage of accelerated approval drugs and did it several years ago. And as Russ hinted at, we're concerned now that Medicare may also be taking a look at this and treating them differently. Within Medicaid, at least, federal law requires Medicaid to cover most FDA-approved drugs, and in turn, they get the best price for them. So it was a trade-off in the law. But unfortunately, their arguments for excluding these medicines or trying to undermine that federal protection is, one, that they're expensive and driving Medicaid spending, and two, that they're, quote, experimental or clinically unproven, and sometimes even argue that they are potentially unsafe, that somehow it's a lesser standard. So I look forward to talking more about that today as well. But specific to Ken's research, thank you, I was going to say next slide, but you beat me to it. Ken looked at Medicaid spending on these medicines over time. So starting back in 2007 and went through 2020 and found that that first argument that they're driving costs is just totally false. They are a tiny portion, in fact, of Medicaid spending, less than 1% nationally, to be more specific. And as you might imagine, he also looked at, being an economist, looked at spending increases. Well, if it's not, a big part of the total spend, what about is that portion increasing dramatically? Is it driving that increase in spending? And the answer was no. As you can see from the map at the bottom of this slide, and I know it's hard to read all the states, but don't worry about that. It's just the colors. All those states in the lightest gray, accelerated approval drugs amount to 25 cents or less per $100 spent in those states on Medicaid. And that's total spend. So that includes the federal share, which is at least 50% of that. And it doesn't include rebates on those medicines, which is another 23% at a minimum. So again, it's tiny. Really de minimis spend on Medicaid, by Medicaid on these medicines. And as the trend lines on the left show, the very, very bottom line in light green, that's accelerated approval spending, total spend on accelerated approval drugs and Medicaid at a national level. Flat and small. The top line, in contrast, is hospital spending. So you can see that has always been much higher, as you might expect, but also trending upward. So it is just not accurate to say that these medicines are driving costs. Next slide, please. What is accurate to say, and I know we'll talk about this more today, is how much the pathway and the innovations that have relied on it are helping patients. We have also started, as a part of our effort, Faces of Accelerated Approval, patient stories, caregiver stories, where people share how they have benefited from medicines using the accelerated approval pathway. And I think it's so important in the debate over accelerated approval, we cannot lose sight of the pathway's purpose and the people not only helped, but literally spared. And I'll stop there. I appreciate your indulgence in letting me share that research, but I thought, given the data, I just wanted to include a few slides.
Thanks, Candace. Now, I think that's really helpful context for the rest of our discussion and kind of putting the discussion that's going on at the federal level around spending on these drugs and kind of a really fact-based and database context. And so as we're going through these questions, I'll direct my questions in most cases, to a specific person to start, but I welcome everyone to weigh in after the first person provides an initial response. So with that, I'm going to actually provide an exception and start with a question for everyone. So what impacts have the accelerated approval program had on therapeutics and drug development in the disease areas your organizations focus on? And do you feel like there would have been the same kind of level of advance so far if the pathway had not existed?
Seems like Maggie should start. You have a good story.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So as I mentioned in the introduction, this has been a crucial program for the sickle cell community. The sickle cell community has suffered for so long and been without treatments available for them. And it's documented that due to racial disparities, due to stigma, and lack of funding, there's been a limited investment and opportunity for treatments to make it to the market. So we're seeing that change, and it's really an exciting time. And however, because of this, the pathway of accelerated approval is so important because it allows our community to have access to treatments earlier, to really address this unmet need because it's there. And every day we have sickle cell individuals that are dying and are suffering. And I think you can talk to an individual who has been able to access the new treatment that is approved through this pathway, and you can see the impact that it's made on their life and on their day-to-day ability to be able to go and participate in work and school. And so I think, like Candace described, showing the faces of the program are really important, because that's where you see the impact. And you can see it in the individuals who are able to have this new potential through the treatments.
And if I could add to that, I think the sickle cell story is just amazing and long overdue. Let's be honest. A lot of pain associated with that condition and under treatment in general. Cancer is another area where we've seen a lot of progress. There was a recent story and it grabbed headlines about 100%, a drug that was 100% effective against a specific type of cancer. And people were just shocked. And isn't that exciting? Well, buried in that story was that the new therapy, potential new therapy, because it was experimental, they were testing it in the clinical trial, was based on a previously accelerated approval therapy, a similar. So it's not just the innovation that affects the specific population, but it also creates and accelerates the innovation for others who may be suffering from similar diseases within the cancer. Cancer space is a great example, but other neurological conditions, the breakthroughs that are made in one condition can really help accelerate access and innovation for other diseases. Cancer, for example, accelerated approval pathway is estimated to get these treatments to patients 3.4 years faster than traditional approval. And if you're living with a life-threatening cancer, months make a difference, but 3.4 years, I just can't even imagine waiting. If you're able to wait, if your health would even allow you to wait that long.
And I guess in Alzheimer's, of course, we were pleased to have an accelerated approval drug. We would love to have access to that for our patients. It really is interesting, though, Michael, you brought up the sort of the drumbeat against it, and Candace talked about the bullseye on it. I think the Friends of Cancer Research did some work on this and found that about 10-12% of drugs with accelerated approval are later withdrawn from the market as not effective as they thought they were going to be. They don't work as advertised, about 10-12%. If you listen to the opponents, you would think it's the vast majority of drugs that are, this is a terrible idea. They forget about all the good that it's done. And I think that it's really important that we think about the effect on patients when we start to get hyperbolic about the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of a pathway. It saved lives in cancer. We would like it to save lives in Alzheimer's. It looks like it's saving lives in sickle cell now. We can't throw out an entire pathway that was created for a good reason because there's a percentage, it's not none. And we think that those 10-12% of the drugs should be withdrawn, and the pathway should be strengthened so that they can be forced to be withdrawn quickly. But we can't generalize. We can't hyperbolize. We've got to do this with a smart approach to public policy that looks at the facts that Candace presented, the facts that Friends of Cancer Research presented, and make sure that everybody that needs access in a serious, it's only available for serious unmet medical needs. This is not going to be for a hangnail. This is for serious unmet medical needs. That means that if you don't do it, people are going to suffer, and in many cases, they're going to die. And you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater just because somebody finds it to be a useful rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sets up kind of important discussion, and I think a lot of what's been going on in the federal space and kind of the recommendations from MedPAC and MACPAC so it's kind of gotten tied up into the cost considerations of kind of drug spending overall writ large in the for the Medicare and Medicaid programs rather than maybe exclusively focused on accelerated approval. So, Maggie, I know that Sixels has been active in this area because MACPAC suggested that they have reduced payment. Basically, the states institute reduced payment for drugs that are approved through the accelerated approval pathway. And until a point that they're able to kind of confirm the primary benefit through additional confirmatory trials. So I know that you all led a patient community sign-on letter not to advance that recommendation. Could you just share a little bit more about that effort and the impact it would have on patients if rebates for drugs approved through accelerated approval were to be implemented?
Yeah. We were happy to lead that. As the sign-on letter shows, this is an important topic across so many different disease communities. So we know that our sickle cell community is not alone, but so much of our advocacy does focus on Medicaid, given really its need to address the most vulnerable populations of our community, and really Medicaid serves over 50% of our community. So that's a huge it's a huge stakeholder for us in determining how we can access our medications. And we believe that, well, our letter to MACPAC really was asking not to advance the recommendation to increase the rebates, because we understand how those unintended consequences will result in what they will look like for our community. We're already seeing across the board that there's limited access for our drugs, for the new drugs that are approved under this condition. And as Candace mentioned in the beginning, it's important to consider the spending, how much the Medicaid programs are spending on these drugs, but then also the other costs. We call them like the unmeasured costs that are outside of what are considered in many of the Medicaid calculations, and those are costs that our patients and caregivers suffer with every day. Those are out-of-pocket costs, or the economic burden, them being unable to participate in work, and limited ability to participate in society. And so our letter really urges MACPAC to consider the broad impact that these diseases have, and think about that in terms of structuring their payment, and essentially improving the access that these vulnerable populations have to these important treatments.
Yeah, and I think that's
Michael, I wonder if I could add to that just
Yeah.
for a second, because one of the interesting things about that sort of cost discussion is, if you listen to some of the folks on the, we need to contain this, we need to stop this, they want to freeze spending at the aggregate level that it currently is at. They want to stop spending on the Medicare system, the Medicaid system. They want to stop healthcare spending, freeze it as it is right now. They don't incorporate, though, the costs that Maggie was just talking about, that we find in Alzheimer's every day with unpaid caregiving and that kind of. It is a non-trivial externalized cost. It's not something that Medicare has to pay for. It's not something Medicaid has to pay for. It's not something most insurers have to pay for, but it's a very real cost in the world. The other thing that's wrong with freezing as it is right now, that's sort of an underlying assumption of a lot of this criticism, is it pits patients against patients. So there's like a new breakthrough thing that's going to be great for some patient or group, let's say Alzheimer's, that has not had an effective drug basically ever. So are we going to then say to other patients, okay, you can't have your drug anymore because there's this Alzheimer's drug out there? Mm-hmm. It's a simple-minded, not very sophisticated way to look at things, and it's not the way to make good policy. Understand that we spend a lot on healthcare in the US. Solving that by pitting patients against other patients is a terrible, terrible idea.
Yeah, can I add to that too? I think you're absolutely right, and you're really hitting on something important. And you see it comes down to the patient level. We're going to keep premiums low for everyone, but we're going to increase, high deductibles. We're going to have co-insurance on specialty medicines for the very, very ill. And it's almost reverse insurance. It's where we're having people with serious illnesses subsidize, the rest of the population. So I agree with you 100%. It's almost flipping on its head, this idea of how health impacts everything. It impacts our family relationships, our ability to work, and those costs that you're talking about, broader costs to the individual and society, but we're ignoring those and just looking at, okay, we got to cap global spending, global budgets on medical care, if you will, and not look at the bigger repercussions. And it's frightening, candidly.
Yeah, I think there's so many, I think, Russ, to the point that you raised, there's just so many external costs that aren't being considered when we're just talking about Medicare spending. We're not considering, I'll just use Alzheimer's for an example, the cost of, to caretakers, for them having to interrupt their lives, to step away from their careers to care for a loved one. We're not looking at the cost of society. We're not considering any number of factors that are really important to have a holistic view of how we actually value healthcare. And we have such a division, I think, between how we think about medical care versus how we think about kind of the social well-being of people in the U.S. that it leads us to very siloed thinking that I think ultimately is very harmful in the terms of even how we think about cost in this discussion. So. And so I guess to follow up on that, I mean, Candace, thanks for sharing some of the key findings from PFCD's recent report. I know you noted that drugs approved through accelerated approval accounted for less than 1% of annual Medicaid spending year over year between 2007 and 2020. So I guess given the limited budgetary impact that was observed, at least among state programs, can you share, I mean, this is this is a little bit of a mind reading exercise, I guess, but could you share a little bit why, in your opinion, this has been a topic du jour of late?
It's a great question, and I wish I did have a crystal ball. I have my own theories, but it's something that Ken and I have talked about a lot. And he has said too, as a health economist, I don't understand why the focus here on this, because you're talking about in Medicaid, such a vulnerable population on many levels. And then you're, trying to deny access to the people with life-threatening and serious chronic illnesses with not a lot, no other treatment options really, or very limited treatment options. I think you hit on something important, and I think it's that larger focus on drug pricing. And I can't help but wonder if some people see this accelerated approval drugs as a potential target, kind of the camel nose under the tent, if you will, for efforts to undermine Medicaid's promise of access, generally speaking, and those federal protections, potentially implementing, price controls or, even larger mandatory rebates like MACPAC was talking about, the health technology assessment and ICER, always trying to, greater influence. And they have that perspective and have said it many times that Russ talked about, kind of pitting people against one another. If you have a serious rare disease versus if you have, like asthma or diabetes or something, a more common condition. It's just, I wish I knew, but that's kind of where I come down sometimes, is that I just wonder if people feel like, given the pathway and some of the trade-offs on looking at earlier clinical endpoints versus waiting to see if it does actually impact life expectancy or otherwise, if that might, people see it as, a potential target, an easier target for these drug pricing, control efforts, if you will. Regardless, I think it's a legitimate threat that we're talking about, and when we really need to watch carefully, or we lose access, this early access and the benefits that the pathways provided.
Yeah, and I know that certainly this has been under discussion, under consideration by Congress this year. During this session, Congress has to pass reauthorize bills that would reauthorize the user fee acts, which at their core are necessary in order to ensure that the FDA has the budget necessary to process reviews for what is frankly an increasingly complex and diverse portfolio of therapeutics. There's new areas added all the time. It feels like digital technologies and everything else. And so As part of the legislation, Congress has also kind of taken the opportunity to evaluate potential reforms to accelerated approval. We've talked a little bit about there are some ways that it could be strengthened, but there's also some proposals out there that could be potentially really harmful. So maybe Russ, I know you mentioned it in your open comments or alluded to it. So maybe you could just start off and share your thoughts on kind of what is under consideration in the User Fee Act legislation as it relates to accelerated approval.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I think it depends on which one we're talking about. There's at this point at least 3 versions that we know of these user fee authorization bills, one of which would basically just reauthorize the user fees as currently and miss a once every 7-year opportunity to really make some policy improvements. We think that would be a miss. The accelerated approval pathway, as you mentioned at the top, Michael, is 30 years old. It's been looked at. It was something that people have looked at in the past and done some things, but it could use some strengthening, especially in light of the attacks from other parts of HHS on it and others, and on potentially some bad behavior from pharmaceutical companies where they don't withdraw drugs that they should, where the timeline for the confirmatory trials that are necessary under an accelerated approval pathway are longer than they need to be. So there are opportunities to improve this, and it would be a darn shame to go with a totally skinny bill that didn't take advantage of those opportunities. There's some things in the House bill that would really help the rare disease folks. And we would like, Alzheimer's unfortunately is not a rare disease. We certainly support our colleagues in rare to get what they need to have done. It would be a darn shame to miss the opportunity, but it needs to get done at some point and it's, people argue about when, but at some point the FDA has to start warning staff that they're going to be laid off. That cannot be allowed to happen. Patients need the FDA at work every day, working as hard as those folks do.
Any perspectives from others on the panel on what's under consideration?
Well, I agree wholeheartedly with Russ. We need an operating FDA and not under the threat of being laid off. So urge that, and we do agree too that there are opportunities for reform. Confirmatory studies are important for all of us, and I think in withdrawing drugs that are not effective also is important, and boosts the pathway, enhances it for all of us. The concerns that we have under some of the proposals is just like, oh, well, we think, X number of years is long enough to get your confirmatory studies done. And it's like, that's not understanding how the pathway works, but also how therapeutic areas are so different, and different drugs, there needs to be communications with the trial sponsors and with the FDA, and let the experts determine that what is expeditious enough and makes sense within that therapeutic area and for that drug. So that was an area of concern with us, but I do think there are opportunities to strengthen the pathway. We just want to make sure that that's what happens and not undermining it, that we keep this innovation and this pathway open.
Totally agree, Candace.
And Russ, I'll also note, I know that Us Against Alzheimer's has been co-leading kind of a group effort whose aim is to identify some common principles on accelerated approval. And this is kind of, to your point, it's important to understand kind of the differences across disease states and some of how things may be different, and come to a common set of principles in order to make sure that everyone's kind of represented fairly in terms of what this pathway looks like moving forward. So I guess if you could just share a little bit of some of the highlights that have come out of that group's work, and if there's been any challenges, frankly, in kind of that coalition effort.
Yeah, so it's the Accelerated Approval Action Network, as you know, Michael, because you're a part of it. And it has been interesting because we have rare diseases and prevalent diseases. We have oncology that's had a lot of success with the accelerated approval pathway, and we have other diseases, including Alzheimer's, that's had little or no success with the accelerated approval pathway. So there's a big diversity in the group. We have agreed on a common set of principles. We sent them up to the Hill. We have been able to agree on what do we think about the skinny bill, and reminding Senator Burr and others what we think is important in addition to a skinny bill. We've agreed on withdrawals. We do agree with the FDA that they should have more clear authority to sort of encourage withdrawals. We were able to successfully, I think, address some of the concern that Candace raised about how long is reasonable for a trial. There was an early version of the bill that was, frankly, for those in the Alzheimer's world where trials take about 5 years, was pretty scary. So we've been able to do a lot together. We told the FDA we want to see them make more use of real world evidence. We've all kind of agreed to that. There were some challenges because not all diseases are created equal. And not all experiences with the FDA are created equal. The review divisions vary, people's experiences have varied, but we've come together on more things than not. And I think it's a great model to think about. You know, we all represent our patients. But I think what I've seen from this, and this is the first big coalition of patient groups that I've been a part of, where we've really tried to get something done as opposed to come around and just meet a little bit, but really tried in a focused way to get something done like this. It's amazing how much we have in common. And if we can truly figure out a way to unite the patient groups, it's going to be a really powerful force. I think it already has been, and it will continue to be, I guess, a powerful force on Capitol Hill if all the patient groups are saying, do this, not that. Please don't do that. Please do this.
All right, and Maggie, I know that you mentioned earlier in kind of your opening remarks that that the sickle cell community and sickle cells recently went through the process in which ICER assesses comparative clinical effectiveness, the value of new treatments, and that you worked with ICER during that process to ensure the voice of patients and advocates were included in that value discussion. So I have a first question that will follow up, but I guess just to start, could you share if during those discussions how accelerated approval status kind of played into some of those discussions around value assessment?
Yeah, we did in 2019. We had 2 new therapies emerge on the market, and that's when ICER conducted the review. One of those treatments being a treatment that was approved through the accelerated approval pathway. This was also the first time that ICER had conducted a review across the sickle cell community. So there were a lot of nuances, specifically in the area of equity considerations, because really this is a population with such an unmet need that it was really critical for the patient voice to be considered. Specifically for the treatment that was approved through the accelerated approval pathway, one of the main challenges that we went into was recognizing and really valuing the patient voice to say that these endpoints are important to patients, that there might not be a whole body of evidence in the way that is available for other ICER reviews, but it's critical for our community. And really specific to that was the decrease of hospitalizations. There wasn't maybe enough evidence to really show there's an expected clinical benefit, of course, but what that means to the individual is that they have 1 week less per year that they're spending their days in the hospital. And it was really hard for us as a patient community to have ICER take that information and really build it into their modeling and consider that a valuable endpoint. And so there were definitely challenges, but it helped us as a community prepare and really understand how we can go about doing the work to demonstrate how important these endpoints are, and what the patient feels and what the patient values should be considered most important in the ICER review.
Okay, and I think you might have answered part of that in this next question in your response there. But I mean, as other patient advocacy groups and disease states are thinking about how to engage in the value discussion of products, like I said, whether it's ICER or some other group, how can patient advocacy groups kind of prepare for those discussions, especially for products that may be approved through accelerated approval?
Yeah, I think to Ross's point, working together across disease groups has been critical for us, has been really helpful. So, learning from what the sickle cell community has done and other communities, I think is a great place to start. But really looking at the endpoints and then taking that back to the community and saying, what does this mean to you? What's your story that I can bring to the table to demonstrate how important this is? Because I think that was something that, we really had to work hard to do in the very short time frame that was an ICER review. And so the more that you could do that on the front end, that you can really work across your community to understand what these endpoints mean and why they're being selected in the clinical trials, I think is an important piece of advocacy that our patient groups across disease populations can really get started in doing.
That's great advice. And I know that I just have a couple of questions that are left. So if folks have any additional questions, again, please feel free to use that Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen and submit your questions. So I'll just ask Candace. I know that you've had longstanding experience with this. I think extending all the way back to kind of when the HIV/AIDS community was kind of helping to get this pathway started. And so I guess what challenges have you faced when educating the patient community on the pathway, and how has that changed over the years?
Well, I think it's so important to remember how the pathway developed and why it developed. And it developed from that recognition that for some diseases, we need access sooner than traditional approval pathways allowed. And the HIV community was fantastic in terms of raising awareness and take no prisoners. And they really changed the face of patient advocacy in a large way too, with ACT UP and other activities about, these people had nothing and were dying, and knew that just the traditional way of doing things was not going to get the relief needed quickly enough. And so using accelerated approval, it allowed the HIV medicines to be approved more quickly based on the impact on viral load, instead of waiting to see, does impacting viral load actually, extend life? Is it life-saving? Is it life-extending? To do those clinical trials, you would have to wait years. You'd have to know the pathway, traditional pathway of a disease that was evolving very quickly. So that was the surrogate endpoint, the earlier endpoint that the FDA accepted and was able to get these treatments to people more quickly. And they were right. I mean, it saved hundreds of thousands of lives. I think in the mid 1990s, HIV was in the top 10 causes of death, and it dropped precipitously from there very, very quickly because of these therapies. And they do similar things with cancer. They look at the effect on tumor growth to determine, and to predict longevity or other clinical outcomes that they're shooting for, but would take longer to recognize. So, the basic ideas of accelerated approval aren't hard to understand. What did happen, I think, and Russ could speak to this more than I could with Alzheimer's disease, there was just, there were messages about your Medicare premiums are going to increase, and they did in fact increase because of this drug. And there were messages about this unproven, dangerous therapy that's going to drive up your Medicare premiums. And we've lost sight of the pathway and the seriousness of the illness, the lack of disease modifying therapies, the fatality of this very, very serious disease, and an opportunity to get medicines to people in a stage of disease that it could make a difference, and using clinical endpoints that are, research driven in the literature, but before, those longer term outcomes. And sadly, I think that has changed the dynamic, and people have lost sight of the benefit of earlier access. They've lost sight that the safety and effectiveness standards are the same. It's not a lower standard. And I see that all the time, how FDA is, getting lax or something. That's not what we're talking about here. It's just an earlier endpoint to measure effect, to allow people with very serious life-threatening diseases earlier access to safe therapies.
I said when there was a conference of some of the payers and provider groups, and I was lucky enough to be there, and I said to the group that was there, we need to be humble about the data when it comes to that drug that went through the accelerated approval process. We need to be humble about the data. The data do not show that this is penicillin.
Mm-hmm.
But it would also be tough to say that this is the worst decision the FDA has made that's going to kill people left and right, which is what some people on the other side were saying. These decisions, we should not do science by shouting, and we shouldn't do public policy by hyperbole. We need to look in a sober manner at the data. We need to look in a sober manner at what will work. We need to not try to fix the entire American healthcare quote unquote system by targeting one particular little sliver, apparently 1% of Medicaid spending. We need to be thoughtful about these things, and you do it in a way that is based on fact and data, and respecting each other's opinions on it. And that was the other sort of, for me, a really disappointing thing in the saga that we had gone through in the Alzheimer's community recently, is that the amount of ad hominem attack was just, I don't understand how that has a place in science. I understand how that has a place in politics, but not in policy. We shouldn't allow that to be a substitute for good judgment.
Yeah, I think that's it's important, because I think to your point, Russ, I feel like the things that are being picked up from politics and kind of the discourse are I think we also learn it probably from kind of online, not face to face with someone, but increasingly it feels like those modes of communication where we're not taking a view that is willing to consider all of the facets of what may be going on, and use it in a way to make a decision that works best for everyone. So I think that's another bigger issue, which unfortunately we're not going to solve today, but it's definitely part of the bigger context. And so I guess just as we kind of wrap up today, I mean, what are, for everyone on the panel, what are the major points that you'd like the audience to take away from today's discussion? And then also for folks that would like to be involved in your respective organizations' activism and efforts around accelerated approval and within your specific disease states, maybe you could just share a little bit of information about that as well.
Maggie, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. So I think most importantly for us is keeping the patient centered, keeping it really at the forefront of our decision making, and that's at the researcher, FDA, and ICER review and payers, ultimately those impacting the coverage decision. So that's something that we work on, that we talk heavily about across our advocacy programs. And for others who want to get involved, we welcome. We're a part of many other, outside of our disease-specific work, we are a part of many other consortiums and community groups. So, we welcome the invitation for those and to work together on these topics. And additionally, we have an ambassador program. So those are individuals who are passionate about sickle cell specific advocacy. And we always welcome new ambassadors as well to join the work that we're doing here. So I look forward to staying connected to those on the webinar today.
Thanks, Maggie.
I'm happy to go next if Russ, if you want the final word.
Up to you, Candace.
Okay, no problem. I echo totally what the other speakers have said. It's so critically important to remember the purpose here and to let science lead. Unfortunately, I think we've entered an era where people do question, and FDA and others have some trust building to do. To reaffirm that, but here's a great way of doing that is just reaffirming the importance of the pathway and looking at reforms that strengthen it and strengthen access for patients moving forward. And we would, stand ready to work with organizations or individuals who are interested in doing that and welcome people participating in PFCD's activities. We're always looking for new faces of accelerated approval. Welcome feedback on materials or other questions that we can do to kind of help, inform the space. If there are, videos or again, other things that we can do to help educate people about the importance of the pathway and what really is involved, we are more than happy to do that. And to that end, thank you so much for hosting the webinar today. So important, and we appreciate being a part of it.
Thanks. Russ?
And thanks, Michael. And I'll echo what my co-panelists have said. I really like that Maggie's first word was patience. And I think that would have been my first word if I would have gone first as well. You got to think about the people, the real people. We heard in the debate about the last drug in Alzheimer's, these people aren't that sick. It was horrifying to hear that. I don't think you would say that about many other disease states. I think when you say, oh, we're spending too much on healthcare, we should freeze everything, you're not thinking about the people who need the drugs, need the healthcare. You've got to put the people first. That's thing one. Put the people first, put the patients first. Thing two, let's base this on science, on data, on real information. Let's make good public policy based on good information and good data. Let's not get carried away with what look like quick fixes and easy targets. There's real people that are affected if you make these decisions. Oh, I should also probably use our website, usagainstalzheimers.org, if you want to get involved. Us Against Alzheimer's, it's probably the longest URL you will type into your browser ever, usagainstalzheimers.org. If you're interested in the Accelerated Approval Coalition, it's also a good place to go, and we can connect you there.
Thanks, Russ. Yeah, and certainly from the Alliance for Aging Research, I mean, this is, kind of given what, as we talked a little bit about today, it's occurred in the Alzheimer's space with Medicare limiting coverage there. And CMS also attempted to do that previously in the oncology space, but due to feedback from patients and clinicians, kind of a unified feedback, CMS actually rolled that back and provided coverage for those important therapeutics in that space. And so the Alliance is looking at efforts and leading efforts to figure out ways to ensure that Medicare does provide a standard expectation of coverage for FDA-approved drugs that are important to the Medicare population. So please feel free to reach out to us as well at mward@agingresearch.org if that's an effort of interest to you. So, and if we can just add the exit slide, I just want to thank everyone for their time today, for joining us for this important discussion. I mean, these are great people that participated and really insightful leaders. So I hope that everyone will continue to reach out to them, and as these discussions around accelerated approval continue. And I know that I will continue my personal interactions and bounce ideas off of them. So thanks everyone again for your time today, and look forward to connecting with everyone soon.